Oh, and good evening. It's November 19th, 2024, and welcome to another one of our branches on the vine with another episode from the folks at Aleph Beta. In this video, we're going to discuss some points from Rabbi Fohrman that I believe are worth pondering. I love connected thinking, one, because of where have we heard that before, and two, then again, how might those things be actually connected? So welcome this evening to another thought-provoking episode from Aleph Beta. What does it mean to make a covenant with God? Tonight on The Dusty Feet. And before we forget, if you find these kinds of podcasts useful, you can click the subscribe button. The reminders, they just help you. But also, if you think these might be useful to others, that's when you click that like button, because that is how YouTube chooses to share these to more people, if they wish. So, connected thinking, chiasms, they're pictures of that connected thought, and the repetition of that thought can ask the question, then are these two connected? Sometimes we can consider whether we hear causes us to pause. And in this case, maybe an ear leaned towards Hebrew will also give us a point to ponder. Learning from young to adult, right? It also includes thoughts about grown-up behavior versus childlike behavior. So let's listen to Rabbi Fohrman, and towards the end, listen for Yeshua and the context. Enjoy.
Hi everybody, this is Rabbi David Fohrman, and welcome to Parshat Lech Lecha. When we think of Torah commentary, what do we think about? Usually we think about people like Rashi, the Ramban, and Sforno. But what if sometimes the Torah is its own commentary? What if the Torah uses discrete tools as a way of embedding commentary within its text? I think there are tools that the Torah uses to do just this, and one of those is what we might call an Atbash pattern. Atbash gets its name from Aleph, Taf, Beit, and Shin. Aleph, of course, is the first letter of the alphabet. Taf, the last letter of the alphabet. Beit, the second to first letter of the alphabet. Shin, the second to last letter. And the idea here is that the Aleph, the first letter of the alphabet, is mirrored by the last letter, and the second to first letter is mirrored by the second to last letter, third to first by third to last, etc., etc. The idea here is that the Torah might use such a pattern, not just in terms of letters, but in terms of laying out larger sections of text. So you might find yourself reading a passage in the Torah and saying, hey, the first part of this passage really sounds like the last part of the passage. The second to first part of the passage really sounds like the second to last part of the passage. Academics will call this kind of Atbash pattern a chiastic structure, a chiasm. Now, why would the Torah do such a thing? I'm going to throw out a theory. The theory is that this is a way of the Torah packing a lot of meaning into a very short amount of space. There are a lot of things that a chiasm does. First of all, it points you towards the center. If you're looking at the first and last element, and then second to first, second to last, and then third to first, third to last, you're eventually converging towards the center. The Torah is defining for you a sort of center of gravity, a main idea which everything revolves around, and that's one way in which this sort of chiastic structure can work as a kind of commentary within the text. Now, this all may sound kind of abstract, so I want to actually demonstrate it to you in a little section from this week's Parsha. The section is chapter 17. It's the story of the circumcision covenant. It's the text of God's revelation of the idea of Brit Milah. Okay, so let's read the beginning of chapter 17 here. Avram is 99 years old. God comes to him and says, there's going to be a deal here. There's going to be a covenant. There are going to be obligations that God has towards Avram, obligations that Avram has towards God. In a moment, we're going to get the terms of the deal, but before we do, verse 3, Vayipol Avram al panav. Avram falls on his face. So here's the fascinating thing. Towards the end of this chapter, you're going to find this very same phrase, Vayipol Avram al panav, again. Very interesting. It turns out that this is the beginning of a chiastic structure, this sort of Atbash pattern. Because right after Vayipol Avram al panav, what's the next thing that happens? Look at verse 4. Verse 4 says, Hine briti itcha, God says, my covenant's going to be with you, and you're going to be the father of many nations. So that's what happens right after what we might call the orange element. Let's color this orange, Vayipol Avram al Panav. Right after that, we'll get to what we might call the yellow element, which is you're going to be the father of many nations. Well, is there a yellow element right before the orange at the bottom of the chiasm? Turns out there is. Not only is Avram going to be the father of many nations, but Sarah, his wife, is going to be the mother of many nations. Okay, so we've got an orange element, a yellow element. Do we have another element? We do. Let's call it the green element, the third element of the chiasm. You'll see it in verse 5, the next verse. Name change. Lo yikare odet shimcha Avram. Your name is not going to be Avram anymore. Your name is going to be Avraham. Wouldn't you know it? The third element of the chiasm mirrors itself at the bottom, and its name changed for Sarah. Vayomer Elokim al Avram, Sarai ishtacha. Sarai is not going to be Sarai anymore. She's going to be called Sarah. She's not just your princess. She's the princess of the world. Okay, take a look at the very next word, right after these first three elements. Verse 6, Vihifreti. Interesting. Do you see any analog for that at the bottom of the chiasm? Oh, look at that. The word hafer. Hifreti, hafer, is the same letters. Hey, pei, resh. Interestingly, the same letters with opposite meanings. Hifreti means I will multiply you. Hafer means to utterly nullify. Look at the larger element, the fourth element. What else happens here? Hifreti otcha b'ma'od ma'od, verse 6. I'm going to multiply you greatly, God says. I'm going to make you into nations, and kings will come from you. Really three ideas. The idea is not only you're going to have lots of children, but they're going to coalesce into a nation, and the nation is going to be governed by kings, that there's actually going to be one autonomous body, one body, that all of these individuals are part of. They're not just individuals. Now look at the fourth to last element. Anybody who doesn't observe the covenant, any male that doesn't circumcise himself, the nichrata nefesh ha'imameh is going to be cut off from your people. So the fourth element at the beginning is, individuals are not just individuals, they're going to be part of a collective. But the fourth to last element is, but if you don't keep the Brit, you're not part of the collective. You're cut off from the klal, you're cut off from the whole. Et briti afer, because you've violated, you've nullified the covenant. So I'll multiply you, and those individuals come together, but if any individual nullifies the covenant, they're not part of the collective. And by the way, this is one way in which Jewish nationhood is different than every other nation. You see, every other nation just comes about by happenstance. It's a king just manages to conquer land, and people aggregate around him for self-protection and things like that. But the Jewish nation is a nation because God created this nation. And this Brit, this deal, this covenant is at the center of it all. If you violate the covenant, your claim to be part of the nation is just going to fall apart. The covenant is essential to nationhood. Let's look at the next element. Verse 7, Vakimoti et briti beincha bein zaracha. I'm going to establish my covenant with you. It'll be a covenant forever. Look at now the fifth to last element. Himo yimo yilid beitcha, v'haita briti b'bsarchem librit olam. Again, the idea of an everlasting covenant. I will establish the covenant, and that's going to last forever. And then having established it, this covenant is going to be visible in your flesh. It's going to be a part of your bodies, and it'll be that way forever within the corpus of the nation. As you can see, we're getting closer and closer towards the center of this text. The next thing you're going to see is absolutely wild. You're going to see a chiasm within a chiasm, a little atbash within the larger atbash. Liot l'cha le'elokim, I'm going to be your God, l'zaracha achrecha, and the God not just for you, but for your progeny after you. V'natati l'cha l'zaracha achrecha eretz migrecha, I'm going to give you this land, I'm going to give you Eretz Canaan forever. Vayiti lahem le'elokim, and I'm going to be for your children a God. Now look at that carefully. What are the ideas? There's three ideas here. Idea number one, I'm going to be a God for you and for your children. Idea number three is the same thing. I'm going to be a God for your children. And in the middle of that, sandwiched between those two, is I'm going to give you the land. Lo and behold, you have exactly the same structure. At the bottom of the chiasm, the next element has that same threefold structure. Unemaltem et basar lodechem, you have to do milah. You have to circumcise. Element A. Element B. V'haya la'ot brit beinu beinechem, and it's going to be a sign of the covenant. Element C. Ben shmodat yam yimolachem. You must circumcise all males on the 8th day. Do you see it? Element A. Circumcise. Element C. Circumcise. Right there in the middle, and it will be a sign of the covenant between us. So you have these two little mini chiasms mirroring each other, and interestingly, the centers kind of connect, don't they? What is it that God is promising Avram in his part of the deal? God is really promising two things: children which will coalesce into a nation, and land for the nation to live in. Now remember we saw earlier in the chiasm how the promise of children coalescing into a nation was dependent upon the Brit. You couldn't imagine the nation without the Brit, such that any person that didn't observe the Brit will be cut out of the nation. Now you see, it's the same thing for land. The centers of these two chiasms, they mirror each other, and what's the center about? The center at the top of the chiasm is, I'm going to give you land. But what's the center at the bottom of the chiasm? But you're going to keep the Brit. Message? The land is dependent upon the Brit. Just as the same way as children coalescing into nations is dependent upon Brit, the promise of land is dependent upon keeping the Brit as well. Which is why, by the way, that in Sefer Yoshua, before the Jews actually come into the land, what do they make sure to do? Everyone stops. And any children that were born and not yet circumcised are circumcised. You don't go into the land without that. Both great promises, children and land, are somehow tied to this essential covenant between God and Abraham's people. Finally, we're ready for the center of the chiasm. The center is kind of a double center, and it's the primacy of the covenant. V'ata et briti tishmor. And you make sure to keep my covenant. Zod briti asher tishmor. This is my covenant that you should keep. The centrality, the need to keep the covenant, is the central idea which all of this revolves around. And this covenant, this deal, God's obligation towards us and our reciprocal obligation towards Him, is that which begins our existence as a nation. It's all predicated on this. Shabbat Shalom to all of you.
Okay, loaded, yes. So, remember, I asked you to think about adult versus childlike behavior, right? Because it seems that, because it's not limited to purely age, it would be more about experienced in something, yeah? So our beginning versus where we expect to be is part of our progressing through learning, right? Because we're going to get into it here, because there's a point where Abraham, and this might be a little challenging, and it's probably going to be a point we're not going to fully address today, right? It's this commitment to the whole group that gets circumcised, right? This covenant that he makes with God. And this includes the people who didn't hear this, right? Who weren't a part of this. They weren't involved in this deal. This covenant that Abraham and God had made, they were still expected to act out, right? So we're not going to have time to get into that. I just want you to be aware that it's still out there, and it is something to discuss and something we can ponder at another time over coffee and donuts. But what we get here is the beginning of something, the start of where we go from here. And so Abraham, in this covenant, and everybody past him is going to do this, right? This is something that we don't see in Scripture, which is interesting because it causes me to think a bit. I would say, maybe, are we supposed to assume that it happened? Or if not, is it something as simple as, okay, it was only for this covenant and these people and Abraham? Because it wasn't just Abraham, remember, that got circumcised. It was him and everybody associated with Abraham under the protection of Abraham, right? All the males are circumcised. Remember, there's no son. It's only him and his male work hands and his servants. So here's the point. So I wonder if his sons, right? Isaac and then Jacob and his kids and all of his associated families, everybody with them, were they all circumcised too? Were they all expected to be circumcised? Was that also what was passed on to you and all of your everybody associated with you? Scripture doesn't talk about it. I just wonder if it's another point to ponder. But in this covenant behavior, we see this with Abraham, how it's played out in this particular covenant that he plays out. And it always throws me this pattern with this connection structure, which I love, right? So we have this chiastic structure. Hope you found it fascinating. always gets me. I think, okay, this is the start of something, right? Because interestingly, as you know, when you read the rest of Torah, you're going to see these type of chiastic connections scattered all throughout. So, okay. So these connected thoughts, all these connected learning instructions or the laws that are scattered around the stories, that are scattered around the laws, that are scattered around the stories, we still see these chiastic connections, yeah. So one of the points the rabbi makes here is that a covenant with circumcision is essential. This is a vital element to this. Okay, that's in the beginning, and it is what they taught. Remember, they teach you young. In other words, this happens at 8 days old. So the picture of the original guys, they were just older. But the males are expected to pass this on, right? They're sort of pass this. The parents are to do this and to teach them, right, going forward. I think what we need to remember as always that we have this story, but yet we're now so far down the road, right, 3,000 plus years after this event. So I'd like to say that maybe they were the beginning. They were the children, right? But now as adults, we should be behaving better. That was the case, we know, with them when they had them in the land, that Sefer Yeshua. I know you heard that, at least I hope. But when Yeshua, right, we hear Joshua, took them into the land, they went in and they were recommitted, right? They circumcised and then moved on. I mean, this is a reminder to separate yourselves, to show that you're dedicated to this. But there's a difference between just dedication and commitment. I want to talk about the difference here. Because I think there's a little bit of difference between dedication and commitment. I'll help draw this picture, right? Because you can dedicate something to something. For example, we can dedicate a building to something. We'll put a little plaque on it and we'll say, this building is dedicated to somebody in memory of, and we can fill in any blank there. But I think what's funny is that even with, we get this, we see an old building. It's dilapidated, it's vacant, or it's been repurposed. And you'll look and you'll see that original purpose of the building, right? This dedication. What it was dedicated for. Still, now it's not doing it. Or one could say it's lapsed into a new purpose. So maybe we have a heart issue here where we needed to stay, right? We see, okay, let's use this picture. We see few businesses today, sadly enough, that have been in business for 150 years, right? We have so much come and go turnover for businesses, and we don't see the commitment. We had dedicated beginnings, but no commitment that we had in those, what do you call them, days of yore. But we see in these stories, they needed to hear, and they got this term from the prophets because it talks about us, drawing us back to this topic, right? Because we have this circumcision, but the prophets go into circumcision of the heart. But we still have this little behavior, this commitment that's been defined. I agree. That's the beginning with the dedication. But if you have a child, it's 8 days old, or you have anybody and you have them circumcised, even baptized, I would say they're dedicated to something, but are they going to stay committed? So we see we have that covenant to land part. Remember that graphic? That was neat. And he drew the graphic of the covenant to land, and they were intertwined. The arrows went both ways. I really, really liked that. Because what God wanted were their circumcised hearts. going into the land, which the prophets had discussed later, right? Because God talks about this with us too in circumcised hearts. So it's not just a story. Because remember, here at the Dusty Feet, we talk about us, right? This is not them. This is us. We're all together. Them and us. This is the we, right? We have this point where our hearts, our circumcised hearts, are these points of something? Is this initial commitment to something that needs to be played out? So let's use this. Oh, wait. Okay, I just thought of this just now. So what about where we're in our past, right, at times, right? Those that are believers in Yeshua, right? Believers in Jesus, right? And we've made this commitment to him. We've dedicated. And again, this is very much going to equate to what we see here, where they commit to God, and they do. That's like a newborn circumcision or a baptism. So we say we're dedicated, right? But what we're really maybe thinking is we're saying we're committed. We've been dedicated and now we're committed. So we're up with it. We're part of this path now, right? Just like the children, initially with Abraham, right? The children get ready to go into this land. I think we're part of those words as we prepare to occupy space. And he's looking for that. And he says, okay, that's that. But will you live it out? Does your heart reflect that in the space? Yeah. And I think we see this also in our Sermon on the Mount series. Yep. Something that I liked with the Bible Project is that inside of that, right, they have some graphics that play out over my shoulder here, right? We get these neon-looking characters. They're reflections of the hearts of the people on the outside, right? They have these angular, very realistic-looking characters. But then we go inside the heart, and they take on this soft, glowing neon look, and it's reflecting this heart, right? Then we see evil eyes, we see all kinds of things, logs and eyes, we see all kinds of lovely, beautiful metaphors, and we see the reflection of those hearts. So I think when we get this circumcision, and we get it, we're getting this. This is what it looked like in the beginning, right? Back in kindergarten. Because if you went back and talked about my schooling, go back to the beginning would be kindergarten or at least elementary school. But then it works its way up through junior high or middle school for those, and then high school. And then for those with advanced education, I'd say we can get to there. Then they look back because all of that was built on previous learning, started at the beginning. Yeah. It's interesting. I think we see this more in other cultures, right? That at least more than I think we do in America. I mean, we do it. I just think we see it there maybe a little more often. Other cultures where somebody's direction to go somewhere is decided, at least for the academic side, way early. That job, that future task, it started much earlier in life with the academic standpoint. They commit in late elementary, maybe early junior high, and that's what drives them through everything else that they're focused to. And that could go to even lawyers and doctors. There's lots of other tasks that are part of this. But it can also go for trades or manual tasks, let's call them. Young kids that are committed to, say, farming. And they start learning very young what it takes to commit to farming, what it takes to have the heart, the dedication to do so. Yeah. What it takes to be a farmer and the responsibility not that they realize they need to get up in the morning and do that, and they know that other people rely on them, right? That sowing and reaping so that they can survive and live, and yet they're relying on your sowing or reaping so that they can survive and live. That's a pretty serious commitment. I like it. So we get to these points. And remember what the rabbi was talking about, because I love how Rabbi Fohrman ties these together, right? All of these are reflected in the community. They're all communal behaviors, they're all communal activities, and they reflect that from Abraham, especially forward. That's why I asked the question, did whatever Abraham and his community do after that, did the sons pass that on? Scripture doesn't mention it. I just wonder if it did. So we get to the point of the land and the covenant. And it's interesting because I think I see a connection that goes on and continues to play on forward. Because he talks about the land and getting back. Still, he talks about God, right, in this. And we talk about his son, Yeshua, that talks about that promised land. Catch what I said? That promised land. And we'll be there. Behold, I prepare a place for you, that promised land. But we have expectations of behavior. We have expectations of behavior within the land, right? We have expected behavior before we get into that land. You know, we had God's will on earth, right? His Torah was passed on to them. We've already discussed this on the will on earth part. We've already had that chat. And so now that will has been given to us. And we live within that framework for now. Maybe here's a picture that maybe for a mental picture, we're living within that framework for those 40 years before they enter the land. So picture this. We have this point where we have a covenant with the land, and then when you don't follow, God tells them, if you don't follow the commitment by action to this covenant, you don't get the benefits of the land. You don't get to stay there. And it's funny, it's not an immediate behavior consequence. It takes generations to decay. I mean, it went on for a long time. Because if you're talking about patience, that would be when God asked them to turn. He used the prophets and that's right. I'm sorry. He asked us to turn. And hundreds of years later, he finally said, hey, I'm a God of my word. And you can't have that. So we reached a pondering point. And we've gone from here. And now we have what we've heard with this story, and then Yeshua in his time and saying the same thing, right? The Sermon on the Mount tells you where's the Torah connection? In the expected behavior. What a citizen of this kingdom, because we're talking about with Torah and the land, that's a kingdom. What a citizen is going to look like in that kingdom. It's right there. We hear it. And then we hear him talking about it, okay? And there's going to be a future with behavior expectations. And I expect this so you can go into the land where he wants you, already trying at least to live that expected behavior before you get there. So remember, I metaphorically speaking, of course, right? This is a metaphor because in the post-Yeshua part, I kind of think maybe now we're in those 40 years before where we go in the land of those, right? We're reaching where he returns, takes over the Joshua leading the people part, right? We heard that, right? We heard Yeshua. We say Joshua. And yet there they gets ready to take them into the land, right? That Yeshua is leading them when he returns. Okay, I don't want to get into the 1,000-year thing. We can talk about that some other time. But we're still getting into this expected behavior in the promised land, the promised things. So we're going to segue this point to the ultimate promised land. And in all that, God has expected behavior. Sermon on the Mount talks all about it. But that heart circumcision, showing you what might not be seen. Look, this is interesting. I thought about this. The circumcision was a dedication, right? And hopefully it led to a commitment. Both are good. You need to follow through with it. But to the community, somebody saw it maybe or did it, but it still wasn't seen, right? It still wasn't seen. In other words, in today's world especially, you can't see if somebody's committed. You can't see if anybody is circumcised unless you see them circumcised. Do you understand what I'm saying? I don't want to be too graphic because we don't need to be, but you're not going to see it. They just had it happen. But our hearts, you know what? You're not going to see it. But are you? Because they are, with both of them, either you're acting circumcised or not. It's always been about the heart. That's the adult behavior. You learn that as a kid. You do many things with kids. Lots of learning goes on with child transitions to adulthood. And that behavior has become more dedicated to commitment to action, right? It's always been. It's not new. But we have this covenant, the Brit, right? And it prepares them for the land that God has prepared for them. And we have a covenant built on this covenant, based on a land, a prepared place for you. And I'll take you there, right? We got both of these stories have circumcision at the core. Because if circumcision wasn't a point, why bring up the point of circumcision of the heart, right? I love that thought. Really, seriously, why bring up circumcision of the heart if circumcision isn't an important thing? But others, technically they don't see it, right? God sees it. You can't get away from that. Those little figures over my shoulder kind of do that. When you were a kid, did you think you were getting away with something? Something and maybe your parents didn't see it? Okay, so I'll wrap this up with a funny story. When I was a kid, we'd get in trouble for something. And my mom would say, a little birdie told me. And we, kids, we needed to figure out who's, right? How's this little birdie telling them how we screwed up? Now, I don't remember whether I figured it out, we figured it out, how I recognized it. And I think maybe it might have been my aunts, right? My aunts were a lot younger than my mom, but older than me. Hence, they were of those ages where they help you tell stuff, right? But however it came up is that telling me that your mom could hear you in the house. So when we talked about doing something or had talked about having done something stupid, they could hear the voices through the air ducts, right? The ventilation. They could hear it in other rooms. So the truth was, we were dropping dime on ourselves. Yeah, Yeah, it is. It's a little funny that I became my own little bird. But the point is that the parents knew because there really wasn't any hiding. God knows. Are we committed? Are we just dedicated? Or are we really committed? And in that commitment, is it your heart? Or is it a circumcised heart? I know it's a load of Bible terms. I also like new hearts. I'd say that with a new heart, you can go and then get a circumcised heart because now you can change. You can change it. But you can also still choose, even after that dedication, not to follow. We see that played out through the entire run of Scripture, that even with the circumcisions and God's will handed to them, us, that you can still choose not to be committed, right? The Bible has stories all over the place about people who chose not to stay committed to the end. So what does it mean to make a covenant with God? Because I think that's a question to ponder. What does it mean? What does Scripture tell us? And what are we prepared to do? How far are we actually willing to go? So, shalom, shalom. Thanks for being with us tonight for another episode of the Branches on the Vine with Rabbi David Fohrman and those wonderful folks at Aleph Beta. And thanks for being with us on the Dusty Feet.